Hello, I'm the Game Professor, and welcome to another Review Roundup, where I talk about the random stuff I've been playing lately and what I think of it. This time I've got just 3 games, one of the more anticipated releases of the year, a big remake of a classic zombie game, and an understated, underplayed sci-fi masterpiece. So let's get started. The Last of Us Part 2, completed main plus extra content. I can't honestly say I was necessarily excited for this one. I really liked the first game and generally expect quality from Naughty Dog, but The Last of Us felt like such a perfectly contained story that I wasn't completely sold on the idea of continuing it. Now that I've played the sequel, well, I still kind of feel that way, honestly, but I'm at least happy to say that the game turned out pretty well. There's a lot more to talk about here than I can contain in a spoiler-free mini-review, but, well, there's a reason this roundup only has 3 reviews, so let's get going. Let's get the obvious out of the way. The game is gorgeous. It's just as technically impressive and painstakingly detailed as you would expect from Naughty Dog. There's nothing surprising here, just a lot of stuff that's just as impressive as you would expect, from the motion captured performances to the gorgeous environments to the meticulous details to the subtle animations. It's all here. It's hard to praise this element of the game without acknowledging the reports of poor working conditions and crunch culture, and that is absolutely something we should be opposing in this industry. So I don't know how exactly to level this praise with that criticism, but both can exist at once. A bunch of talented people were exploited to make this game as gorgeous as it is, and we can oppose those workplace practices while appreciating and praising what those workers put out. Let's just still advocate for better treatment, too. As for how the game turned out on a narrative level, wow, does your mileage seem to vary on this one. I've heard all sorts of praise and criticism for this game, and overall, I lean on the side of the praise, but that's not to say my position is without criticism. The Last of Us Part 2 is about a revenge quest. It's an extremely dark game, darker than the previous one by a good mile. It's about losing yourself in obsession and doing things that can't be undone. It's about grief and about going too far. It's about the moments when we forget that everyone around us is just as human as we are. And it's about forgiveness, though mostly about the lack of it. And it's, overall, a well-presented story to that end. I've seen a lot of concern about how the story approaches the bad things you do, because, yeah, you control characters as they do some pretty messed up things. But now that I've played it, I honestly think the idea that the game is trying to guilt-trip you is extremely reductive. Ever since Spec Ops: The Line, we've seen a pushback in games criticism against the idea that games should ever make us feel guilty for things the game made us do, and yeah, that is kind of manipulative, but that criticism is also seriously missing the point in The Last of Us Part 2. And in Spec Ops, for that matter, but that's another conversation for another time. The Last of Us Part 2 does a lot of things to make the people you're killing feel more real. Aside from how some of them are involved in the story, even just the random grunts you fight will call out the name of a character you shot. You'll find notes about people trying to survive, then they'll attack you and you will have to kill them. There's a lot of work put into making sure you know that every single person you kill in this game is a human with their own relationships and fears and dreams, and you just cut their life short. And yeah, with absolutely no other work put in to direct that move, it could be seen as kind of empty and manipulative. There's little to be gained from just saying, these are real people and killing them is wrong, but do it anyway, if the only goal is to make the player feel somehow responsible. But I don't think that's what this game is doing. Ellie is responsible, just like Joel was responsible for what he did in the first game. The Last of Us, as a series, has no interest in how closely you identify as the player character because it's not about you, it's about Ellie. It's her story, not yours, and the game never once makes any attempt to claim otherwise. It doesn't have to. The power of interactivity inherently makes us feel a connection with the protagonist, whether we want to or not. These games play off of that to create a disconnect between you and Joel, you and Ellie, you and Abby, and they always have. So no, The Last of Us Part 2 is not interested in making you feel guilty. What it is interested in is making you feel uncomfortable, and on that front, I think, is probably the game's greatest achievement. I have never played any other game that made the process of fighting people so thoroughly unpleasant and unenjoyable. Not because of bad gameplay, obviously, I've played plenty of games like that, but intentionally, through good and compelling design. It doesn't feel cool or fun, but it feels real. Combat is tense and dirty and always results in arbitrarily taking life in a conflict that has no greater meaning. Nothing is gained from it. This obviously doesn't apply to the zombie segments since, they're already dead, and honestly, the game does stumble a bit later on by introducing enemies that don't get this same sympathetic treatment, so the effect sort of wears off as the game continues, but still, generally speaking, I can't think of another game where I actively disliked the process of fighting enemies, not because of the mechanics, but because of how it made me feel. Some games with choice have done that, like Undertale, but games where you choose violence or non-violence are a completely different conversation from games where the violence is mandatory. And Spec Ops sort of did it, but that was by building light, brainless twitch shooting and subverting it narratively. The combat was designed to be rote, not unpleasant. This has been a conversation in gaming for a long time. Can a game about killing people condemn that violence without glorifying it through its gameplay? And The Last of Us Part 2 has, in my estimation, accomplished that. And not in a cheap way, either. Honestly, reports of the game's blatant emotional manipulation were greatly exaggerated. It's just well-written, consistent storytelling, mixed with combat designed to be viscerally and emotionally uncomfortable. But, narratively speaking, well, the game is pretty complex, insofar as there are a lot of characters with a lot of emotions and motivations, both implicit and explicit, and there's a lot of discussion from a lot of various perspectives and opinions, because, put simply, this story has a lot of room for those mixed, varied readings. And as for my own issues with it, the game's pacing is sometimes a bit wonky in that all-too-typical way video games do, where it feels like it's stalling for time by constantly putting arbitrary obstacles in place for me to get around instead of moving the story forward more meaningfully. This is fine sometimes when there are other characters around. There's in-game dialogue that's incredibly endearing and gives us a sense for these people we're with, but especially when the player is alone, these sections feel unnecessarily bloated, and the game is just too long for that stuff. The story also has multiple pregnant characters, and it treats pregnancy kind of weirdly, almost like it's a way to make a woman's life more valuable than it supposedly already is, which honestly feels more manipulative than any of the supposed guilt tripping. And while I won't go into any details on the ending, I have some mixed feelings. They did some really weird stuff with the pacing in the last hour or two of the game, and I honestly think it could have been improved by removing that entire last section and infusing a couple specific plot points and flashbacks into the earlier parts of the game. Also, some segments of this game just should not have fail states. It feels weird when AAA games fudge the dice so often but still treat certain dramatic moments as a test of skill that can be failed instead of a moment of drama best left to play out at the player's hands. It undercuts the tension and replaces feelings of sadness and reticence with frustration and a competitive drive to succeed, and that's not great sometimes. And this is a problem easily fixed, but the game had a few moments where it really should have just removed the capacity to fail for a moment and just didn't. The Last of Us Part 2 is one of those games where there's just a lot to say. I've got like 5 episode ideas for it, and time will tell which, if any, see the light of day. It's a complex game with loads of ups and downs, tons of value, and plenty of shortcomings, some blatant and some nuanced, most wildly subjective. And who knows, maybe I'll tackle it in full sometime like I did the first one, but overall, I found the experience to be a positive and worthwhile one. A recommendation comes with a huge caveat that this game is not fun, it will not make you feel good, but I've always believed video games can offer value beyond that anyway, and this one definitely qualifies. I'm giving it an A-, and ultimately, I'd say it's worth a go as long as you're in a place to withstand a game so intensely dour. Resident Evil 3 Remake, completed main content. I have very little experience with Resident Evil, as in I've played the first few minutes of 4, the first few hours of 7, and the RE2 remake. So that's the perspective this review is coming from, one where my only real frame of reference for this is from a few extremely different Resident Evil games, and also the 2 remake. Resident Evil 3 takes place concurrently with 2 during the same outbreak in Raccoon City that 2 was centered on, and in many ways it's very similar to the 2 remake, but well, okay, so you know how some people complain that Final Fantasy VII turned the series into sci-fi instead of fantasy, even though Final Fantasy VI, a similarly incredible and beloved game, was full-on steampunk with trains and chainsaws and freaking mechs, so it's the more logical turning point there? I often hear people say that Resident Evil 4 was the beginning of the series' turn to cheesy action games, but Unless this remake is substantially different from the original game, the turn from survival horror in Resident Evil 2 to action horror in 3 is palpable here. That's not to say all the old elements of the previous game are gone. The basic structure is still the same, wandering a series of open areas to find the tools or keys that allow you to further open it up and eventually move on to the next, while zombies and monsters wander around getting in your way, but the emphasis seems to be far more centered on big, bombastic set-piece moments this time around. The easiest comparison to make here is with the game's big bad zombie monsters. Mr. X in Resident Evil 2 occasionally shows up for big moments, but for the most part he's a constant presence, stalking you from all around the area. His heavy footfall's a dire warning that you have to get out of here before the invincible zombie man finds you and smashes you to bits. His equivalent in RE3 is Nemesis, a giant monster who only shows up in moments when he's supposed to, smashes everything up, and makes you either run or fight. In its best moments, RE2 is about a constant awareness and creeping dread. RE3 is a lot more about exciting chases and fights with big monsters. And that's not to say the game is bad, not at all. The presentation is top-notch, with detailed visuals, enjoyable performances, and some legitimately impressive environmental design. It's not devoid of fear or oppressive atmosphere, and that thing these games do where they keep track of each zombie, where they are, whether you've killed them, and whether they're up or not when you get back to an area, is still just fantastic. But ultimately, I kind of miss the relative subtlety and creeping dread of the Resident Evil 2 remake, compared to this game's relatively in-your-face approach. And yes, I do remember the zombie alligator from RE2, but let's just forget about that, speaking generally here. I am, however, very much here for two particular things. First, this game made it clearer than ever that Umbrella is doubling down on everything they've done at the cost of countless lives for the sake of profit. Always nice to see a game dive headfirst into the expansive evils of greedy megacorporations protecting their financial interests. It doesn't have anything particularly powerful, new, or nuanced to say about it, but it's still nice to see it. And second, Jill freaking Valentine. All I knew about her before playing this game was that dorky line from the first game.
You were almost a Jill sandwich.
But man, I love her so much. She's so cool, so principled, and by the end of the game, she's just so done with this crap, and I will play more of this series just for her. Which, I guess, just means the first game and Revelations, and 5, but I've been told it will disappoint me on the Jill Valentine front, so whatever. In any case, she's fantastic. Give me more of her, please. In the end, I enjoyed both of these remakes a lot, and it's been nice to dive into this beloved series that I've never really taken the time to try out. The RE3 remake didn't work quite as well for me overall as RE2 did, but it's still an excellent game with some scary moments, a super cool heroine, and it just looks and plays so dang well, perfectly updating the refreshingly old-school design sensibilities with a more modern look and feel. I'm giving it a B+, and a recommendation for anyone who would like to see some old-school survival horror with a refreshingly modern coat of paint. The Outer Wilds, completed main plus extra content. How do I even talk about this one? Okay, so The Outer Wilds is one of the most beautiful games I have played. But I don't just mean that in a superficial sense. Like, when I say Wind Waker, for instance, is a beautiful game, I'm mostly talking about it visually. Not that the game as a whole is lacking beauty, of course, it's fantastic. This isn't a dunk on Wind Waker is great, but the experience as a whole is a lot of things before it is beautiful. What beauty there is mostly comes from its visual presentation. The Outer Wilds is a holistically beautiful experience. Everything about it is beautiful. It's a slow, recurring exploration of a wondrous solar system with such depth of mystery and creativity that every new journey feels like a dive into the beautiful, terrifying, boundless unknown. It's one of those things that's legitimately hard to put into words, which means it's another one of those reviews where I highly suggest you stop this video and go play it before I even talk about it anymore. It's that kind of good game. Going in blind is highly recommended, and you will not regret it. The basic premise is that you're the newest explorer of a small solar system. You don't start off with any specific instructions, just the knowledge that there is a lot to find, and there are also other explorers on various planets, which you can find by zeroing in on the signal coming from their instruments, all playing different parts of the same song in tandem. But after about 20 minutes, the sun explodes, consuming the entire system and yourself, and you wake up, Groundhog Day style, ready to explore again. But there's also the remnants of an ancient civilization here, and finding their ruins leads you on a journey to discover what they did and how you might escape this fate. You explore ancient caves as they slowly fill up with sand, traverse a planet that progressively falls apart into the black hole at its center, navigate a planet of continually recurring pocket dimensions, find a moon that only seems to stay in one place if you're actively looking at it, and you'll do it all again next loop, slowly discovering the hidden truths of the universe and unlocking the ways to find out even more. Much of what makes this work is the creativity of the planets themselves. Those caves that fill up with sand are actually on one of two small planets that orbit each other and deposit sand between themselves. So one is a cave system that slowly fills up over the course of each loop, and the other is a giant ball of sand that slowly shrinks to reveal ancient structures underneath. There's also a giant water planet that can be traversed all the way through its core, but only if you're resourceful and creative enough to figure out how. Another crumbles over the course of the loop, leaving you to rush through the first while each time you wake back up so you can get where you need to go before it falls into a black hole and gets deposited into empty space at the outer edge of the system. And the game tells you very little about all of this. There are some chat logs and such that help fill in blanks that hint at where you need to go next, but for the most part, you're on your own to explore, see how things work, and come back to try things and reach new places when next you wake, armed with the information you discovered through all your previous loops. It's a game about understanding the world around you and devoting yourself to discovering more of its workings. But more than that, well, I can't even talk about what it actually is, what it really means. Not here, not before you experience it for yourself. We're so used to these kinds of save-the-world scenarios that it's jarring when a game isn't so much about that, but about beauty and process, about the worlds we make and the efforts we pursue and the things we do together. The Outer Wilds is a game about life and majesty and mystery, and it's one of the most unique and effective things I've played in a long, long time. So in Games as Lit 101, The Outer Wilds is getting an A+, and a recommendation to literally anyone, but especially if you're into slow-burn sci-fi, creative exploration games, and feelings of existential ennui mixed with boundless wonder. That's all for now. Thanks to all my patrons for supporting the show. I love you all and couldn't do this without you. If you want to join them, check the description for a link. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.